Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We have, we're ready to start a new book.
Brand new book,
and you're always excited about that.
I am.
Well,
the book itself is like 4,000 years old. But...
which means we're going into the Old Testament. Yeah. And it's got a weird name.
It does.
The Hebrew name is, "And He Called." All right, pop quiz. See if you can guess. If you haven't looked at the title screen on this video yet.
Yeah, I was like, cheating.
And he called.
Right.
It sounds like a continuation, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's actually really good, isn't it? So it's Leviticus. but if you start with Genesis, the beginning, Exodus, okay, that one makes sense, right? We're exiting.
Egypt,
also called into the wilderness.
Yeah, the Hebrew names. So fun fact. So most of our English titles actually come from the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. The Hebrew names often are like the first word or first phrase. So the first word of Leviticus is, "And he called," or "and God called to Moses." And so this is a book of instruction. Right. God is calling to Moses saying, "This is what I want you to tell the people. This is what I want you to do." The word Leviticus comes then from the Levitical system, the tribe of Levi, right? The priests come out of the tribe of Levi.
Relating to the Levites, I think.
Yeah.
Something said.
Yeah. So both names make sense, but I mean.
Yeah. So and it's kind of cool. And if you remember the Exodus, right? They're taken off out of Egypt, and they make a couple stops, and actually at one of these stops the law was given to them, right? Moses went up into the mountain, got the law, came down. This is really that story.
So this is
part of that story.
Yeah, so the book of what we call the book of Leviticus takes place over a span of maybe 30 days.
Right.
While Israel is parked at Mount Sinai. Yeah. Now they're at Mount Sinai for a year. If we're reading through Exodus, it doesn't feel, well, maybe it does feel like a year, but it doesn't take a year to read through Exodus. Right. But they're parked there for a long time.
Yeah, so we're not after Exodus.
It's really it's part of the part of the Exodus story, if you want to look at it that way.
Yep. Okay, so it's really the giving of the law. And we're talking, all the rules that they have to follow, all that fun part. So the first question is, as a Christian, why do I care?
That's a really good question. Because, and there's really two sides to that. The real part of the question, why do I care, is you're making an assumption it doesn't apply to me anyway, right?
You tell me week after week that I cannot apply.
Because
this was given to a completely different set of people.
To the nation of Israel for them to live while they're in the land so that they could be that bright light, the city on the hill concept for the whole world, right? They were supposed to be so different that the world could not help but look at them and say, "How do you guys do it?" And they would say, "Come check out our God."
Yeah, come see it.
So, this was never given to the church. So why do we care? Because it still tells us something about God. I mean, we're not gonna get into all the details. I'll just tell you right now on the videos, we're not gonna get into all the details. We'll bring up a few details, but I want you to pay attention to the details. Right?
How detailed this is.
Super detailed.
Here's what you can do, and by the way, don't do this. Do this.
Yeah.
This piece goes here. Never do this.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
Either God has some kind of sadistic twist to his character, his nature, or he actually cares about the details.
Right.
And so I think one of the reasons that we should read through this and care about the law, even though it doesn't apply to us, it does tell us something about God and his character. And as we go through here, we do learn about the things that we've done a series on Hebrews. We've done a series on, I think, Galatians. We've done a series on some of the Gospels. That's what these people were living under. Right. So if you understand the book of Leviticus, in fact, I'll point one out here in just a couple of minutes, you'll understand a little bit better when Paul
what
says
happened.
or when Jesus
Yeah, the
says or when
impact that
somebody
meant.
says something, it's like, oh yeah, that's where
I
this
agree.
came from.
I was going to say too, it's part of our history, right? It's how we got here.
Yeah.
It seems like a wandering trail, but it's a laid out plan.
Yeah.
On how we got here.
The first Christians were all Jews.
Right.
You get the book of Acts. The first Christians were all Jews. This is what they grew up with. Actually, this plus, because of the Pharisees, right? But this is what they grew up with. This is all they knew.
Right.
And so when the church started, they were still under the assumption that they were following a lot of this.
Yep. Or had to follow.
Or had to follow it. They didn't have to, and that's something they learned along the way.
Right.
But the very first Christians, this was their Bible. This is what they were
Christianity
following.
was like a bolt-on of their current religion.
Yeah.
Instead of something new and different.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a word that kind of permeates around here, atonement.
Yeah.
So what's a good definition for atonement?
Really, atonement means to cover. To cover. This is one of the reasons I don't like using the term atonement when it applies to Jesus, because Jesus didn't just cover sin, he actually paid for it. The whole purpose of the atonement, especially with the sacrificial system, Romans 3 tells us that God overlooked the former sins while he was waiting until the right time to send Jesus. Well, how did he? I mean, he didn't overlook it like, I
forgot about
it. What he did is he had it covered temporarily with the blood of bulls and goats and the sacrificial system.
Yep.
So the Hebrew word for atone or for cover is kafar. So in Hebrew, you keep the consonants and you switch the vowels around, and you can go from verb to noun to adjective to whatever. So kafar sounds like Kippur, which is Yom Kippur, the day of
atonement.
covering, the day of atonement, right?
Right.
The hat that that the Orthodox will wear.
Right.
Now, the Yiddish word is yarmulke. The Hebrew word is kippah, from kafar. It's the same. It's a covering. So you see these words,
commonalities.
they're working out. But the atonement, every time you read atonement, I want you to read covering, not payment. This didn't pay for sins. The book of Hebrews says that the blood of bulls and goats could never pay for sins. They could only temporarily cover sin.
Right. Okay. All right. So we get into chapter 1. I think this week we have chapters 1 through 5.
1 through 5, yeah.
Right. And we're going to see a bunch of similarities. We're going to see things that look like they're repeated, but they're slightly different.
Yeah.
And which part of it is how well do you read it?
Yeah.
Right. It's
not
a hard read. It's
No.
just the details in it. And man, what is going on here? Why are we doing this?
Yeah. So the first 7 chapters, which gets us into next week, but the first 7 chapters really lay out the basics of the sacrificial system.
Right. And this is really how to atone for your sin. So this isn't the rules. This is when you break a rule, here's what you got to do to get right again. Here's the covering.
And that's what most people think
Yeah.
of the sacrifices. But there were also free will sacrifices. There were thanksgiving offerings. There were dedication offerings. And in fact, chapters 1 and 2 talk about these dedication offerings. So let me bring this in.
Yep.
So in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he's scolding them for holding up their traditions while they break the law. And he says at one point, the law says you're supposed to take care of your parents. Okay, but you will go to your parents and say, oh, I have this stuff that I would love to be able to help you, but it is, and Mark actually puts in the Hebrew word, it is korban. It is dedicated to God. It's like you're reading through Mark, you're like, I don't know what this korban is or why he cares, right?
Right.
Korban is the Hebrew word that we find in verse 2 of chapter 1. When someone among you presents an offering. This is a dedication offering. This is not about sin. It's not about guilt. Okay. This is, I am dedicating this to the Lord. This is now korban. So Jesus comes through and says, you've placed everything in your house under the category of korban, so you don't have to take care of your parents when they're old. Yeah. It says, that's not how you're supposed to use the law. But again, when you come to the Gospels, this is where it comes from. So Jesus is referring to Leviticus 1 when he says that.
Okay.
Okay, a dedication type offering.
Right. So we see that there's an animal involved, and the animal can be from what is it, a herd
Or a flock.
or a flock?
Yeah, so if it's a herd, it's a bull. If it's a flock, it's like a ram or a
sheep
goat
or
or a sheep or
yeah.
something. There's birds too.
Right.
You know, you can do birds, and some of this is based on your poverty level, your social status. Some of it's just based, again, with dedication offerings or free will offerings. This is what I have. I just want to give it to you. I want to dedicate this, and it's
Right.
okay.
So the interesting part here is we have Levites that are here, right? The priests are here, and they have specific functions
Yeah.
that they need to fulfill. So they're all over in here,
Yeah.
and with parts, and they have specific duties. And I think next week we really read the same kind of verses, but from their standpoint.
Yeah.
Right, and see where they're going. So hold off on the priests for a week.
Well, notice while they're doing this that some people have this idea. I know I did for a long time. Have this idea that the person brings their animal and just sort of hands it over to the priest, and the priest does all the work. That's not what you're going to find in here. Again, read it.
Yeah, I mean they're putting their hands on the animal. The animal is slaughtered.
Yep.
And then specific things have to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And like you were saying, God seems to care.
Yeah, very
Right?
deeply.
He seems to care deeply about blood.
Yeah.
And then we were kidding before, kidneys.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
fat.
and you asked the question, why would that be?
Yeah.
Because it filters out the blood. So
Right.
there's a big blood thing in here, and in fact, with the blood, it even goes over to the New Testament too.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, this is one of those great examples of how there are certain things that were just for Israel at this time, but there were certain things that are in the law that what I call timeless truths. They're not just for Israel at this time. So, for instance, you can't eat the fat, which brings in one point that some of these, especially some of the free offerings and whatever, the people were eating. This wasn't just like a whole burnt offering where everything just gets burnt up. This was a subsistence for the priests, right? This was, some of the grain offerings and everything, food for the priests. The people got to eat this, but you cannot eat the fat. Now, some of you are thinking, man, I love a little bit of fat on the outside of my steak. That is so flavorful, the whole thing. The law says you can't eat the fat. But the reason for that is because the fat represents the richness of it. And God says, the fat's mine. God likes fat.
Well, and it went up in a burnt offering, right?
Offering for the
or for the good aroma.
Yeah,
there,
God
the
likes
smoke.
the smell of burning fat. Okay,
Don't we all?
Yeah, that's right. That's the thing. God says, that's mine. That's my cut right there. You don't get any of that.
Exactly.
But that was just under this law. God also said you cannot eat any blood. You don't eat blood. You don't drink blood. That's not just for the law. That goes back to Genesis 9. Like you said, it shows up again in the New Testament. That's a timeless truth. We don't eat blood. We don't drink blood because that's always been the pattern for all people of all time.
Yeah.
Fat, that's limited to this point.
Right. And meat juice doesn't count.
And meat juice
blood.
is not blood. Yeah, meat juice is not. That's slaughtered.
Right. Okay, so there's an offering of birds in here also.
Yeah, it's part of the same thing, though. It's just...
Yeah, but the first thing I thought of was Mary and Joseph around Christmas time. They make a dedication for their son, and they don't have enough money, so there's 2 turtle doves or whatever.
And a partridge.
Yeah,
No.
right.
Sorry, that's the wrong.
Right. Is that this?
It's the same type of thing. We'll see later in Leviticus for the purification of after a birth. It does the same thing. Bring a lamb or whatever. If you can't afford this, bring this. If you can't afford this, bring this. And that's one of the things that tells us that they were very poor. That's before the wise men showed up with gold and right. They were very poor because they couldn't afford anything except for these two turtle doves or pigeons or whatever, right?
Right.
So it's the same type of thing. It's the
Okay.
same type of thing going on.
Okay, so there's a couple different type of dedications and sacrifices, and then there's also different kinds of offering. Like there's a grain offering that you brought out.
Yep.
So you also brought out it's generally always wheat, and not barley. Right? Barley is the cheaper
Yeah.
grain, so you wouldn't use that. You'd use the more expensive.
Yeah, and in some of these, and it may just be the way the net is translating it, like choice wheat, fine flour, the highest end that you can give. Yeah.
I thought it was kind of cool in there. A lot of times they're adding olive oil and they're adding frankincense.
Yeah.
And there was a study note, looking up, and it said frankincense seems to be mostly odorless until it's burned or on fire. So once that flour is cooked, that frankincense would start giving off its aroma and smell.
Yeah. And that's one of the things about the whole temple system or tabernacle system is, I mean, if you can think, there's animals and there's flesh burning, and some of these are whole burnt offerings and some of them are partial. And okay, fat does smell good a little bit, but sometimes it's
not
really
for 24/7.
And the altar, we'll find out next time, the altar can never go out. They have to constantly keep it stoked. There's always stuff burning. So there will be an incense that has to burn along with it. Sometimes there's frankincense that burns along with it. And I think that's good for the people. That's good. How would you like to work in that environment? The priest that wears a gas mask every day, right? Frankincense does smell good. I use frankincense oil for some things, and if it's a resin, right? So if all you do is you have this hard resin, it's not going to do anything. But if you shave some off and you put it in the fire, or you distill it down, and get the oil and stuff out of it, it really does smell good. And it's got some great medicinal uses. And so they were using it for other things. And like I said, don't forget, the wise men brought some for when they came to Jesus, gold and frankincense and myrrh, which is another medicinal use thing. Yeah. So, chapters 1 and 2 are basically dedication. Chapter 3 talks about a peace offering, which we'll come back to next time with some more detail.
Okay. Chapter 4 and 5 are close to each other, right? But it's now a sin offering.
Yeah, so it's a whole new category of why are we giving an offering.
So a dedication, I didn't do anything wrong. Things are good.
Yep.
One dedicated. Sin offering, I did something wrong.
Yeah. This is really what most people think of when they think of the sacrifices, right?
And there seems to be two. There's a sin offering, and then there's sin and guilt.
Yeah.
What's the difference there?
So the sin offering, and I think it's for different types of sin. Okay, so there's a guilt offering that if you did something unintentionally, you didn't know about it, but it affected like holy items, then there's a whole ceremonial uncleanness that had to happen, whatever. Okay. Right. Sin offering was if you broke any of these commandments.
I'm sorry, just laughing because one section was, all right, if you're cooking with something and you've sinned and that the cookware becomes contaminated, you can't use it. And if it's pottery, you throw it away. But if it's copper, you wash it out. Yeah.
I mean,
there's that details.
Yeah. Yep. So if it doesn't have to do with a holy item, then it's a sin. If it's breaking one of the commands, then it's a sin offering. But sometimes it's more than just a sacrifice, and we'll see this again in the future. Some of this, like you said, some of this stuff is going to keep coming up. If it's theft, then there's going to have to be repayment, and there's all sorts of other things in addition to the sacrifices.
Right.
The interesting thing about chapter 4 is that this has it broken down pretty clearly, so you can see if it's a priest who sins, if it's the whole congregation who sin, if it's just one of the leaders, not a priest but not a common guy, or if it's a common person who sinned.
That's next week.
No, that's here in chapter 4.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
A lot of similarities, but a few differences.
Yeah.
And God says that the offering is going to be dependent on your status.
Which makes sense, right? If you think about it, and a number of these make sense.
Yeah.
We had said before, okay, God wants the fatty part, probably for the smell, but also, like you said, the richness in there.
Yeah.
Blood is off limits. It's His because there's living blood, and He considers it sacred.
Yep.
And kidneys filter.
Yep.
Which never even thought of it from that standpoint.
Yeah. So they're very dirty, and they've got blood. again in them, so you're not going to eat it or whatever because it's
right.
you know if it's
But that kind of, it just makes sense. And then even with the grain sacrifices, and in this food, and you also think that it all gets burned up, and what a waste.
yeah,
But it's not.
it doesn't. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
It gets used.
Yep.
And and then we find out that the priests eat part of
Yep.
it, but not other parts.
Yep.
And the priest that's involved with it gets, I don't know, of the choice pieces.
Yeah.
But they get something different versus the other priests who didn't help out with the sacrifice.
right.
Yeah. So it's all kind of down
Because the
there.
priests are let's use some the priests are you say on call, or they're in the office, for 7 days. They don't get to go home, because if they went home, then they'd be unclean and they'd have to go through the whole cleansing ritual every time.
Right.
So they go into the temple and they're basically in lockdown for 7 days or 14 days or whatever their rotation was. Okay. Which means they've got to have food, but somebody can't just bring them stuff into the temple.
Right.
So it's these sacrifices that helped feed the priests while they're on duty.
So how often would they be on duty? I know it depends on how many.
It depends on how
there
many.
are.
Yeah. So by the time we get to David, David actually set up 26 2-week rotation, like every year. But it was your clan, so your clan had a 2-week rotation. But if your clan has 7
people,
brothers in it or whatever, you could be on for 2 weeks once every 7 years or once every 15 years. Some people think when we get to Luke chapter 1, Zacharias and Elizabeth, right?
Yeah, it was his first time.
It may have been the only time in his lifetime that he actually got to serve for those 2 weeks or whatever. So we don't know, because it depends on the number of people. Right now we're starting with Aaron and his sons, so they're pretty much always on call.
Right.
Because remember, it's not the entire tribe of Levi
Right.
that were priests. The entire tribe of Levi was dedicated to serving God, serving in the temple and the tabernacle, serving amongst the tribes. But only Aaron's family actually is where the priests came from. So the priests were a subset of only one tribe. Yeah. And we'll get into some of that more as we go through Leviticus. A lot of that's actually in Exodus, because some of that's already set up, because that had to be set up before God gave this instruction. So that's what we're doing now.
All right. Well, the good news is that brings us to the end of this week.
Yep.
The bad news is we got 22 more chapters to go through, and I don't think it's going to change very much. Right?
Well,
the level of detail is.
What's interesting, there really is a lot of interesting stuff in the book of
there is.
Leviticus if you take the time to read it.
Right.
We're going to learn about the feasts. We're going to learn about all of the the clean and unclean animals and what you can wear and what you can't wear. All that stuff is packed in here.
Right.
But don't just rush through it. The readings are not that long, right? A chapter or less typically every day, right?
Yeah. And I would even say when you're reading the next chapter and you're like, man, I just read this. There's something different.
Yeah,
in
look
there.
for the differences.
Take the
Look for the
time to find
details.
it.
Yep, that's a really good point. So enjoy. Most people are not going to tell you to enjoy Leviticus. We are going to tell you to enjoy Leviticus. And come back. Because we do have several weeks to go through these 27 chapters, and enjoy that you don't have to follow all this stuff, but also learn a little bit of something about your God, who did care about this detail for this people, and there was a reason for it, and a lot of it is explained in here. So hopefully you'll learn a lot. We'll see you back here next time, and we'll just keep going here in Leviticus.
Bye, everybody.